So I've been around a long time. That's the thing, and I've got a lot of fun stories to tell, but we'll see how long it takes me to get through some of this stuff. So there's heroes in mine. I think that was good for me to have heroes. And if you can find some heroes, I think it helps to try to emulate or take parts of this and that and build them into the things that you're going to be using. So my mentors were Wilfred Rawl, the father of dendritic cable theory for neurons, and Joe Keller, probably one of the best applied mathematicians since 1950 in America from the Courant Institute. And the love and guidance was from my mother and from my wife, Kathy. And those were really important things in taking me through my life. So let me start out as a kid. I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin near Milwaukee. Small, I mean a few thousand people. And this was in the 1950s when I was like 7 years old. And the jobs that people had in that small town were farming or blue collar factory workers or construction. This was post-World War II, and the building was going crazy. Everybody wanted a house. They wanted to move from the countryside into the city and small towns, and the housing boom was extraordinary. Several of my uncles and my father were in that house construction business. My father was a stonemason. So this small town was a typical American pie town in the Midwest. If you've heard of Bill Bryson, the author of Walk in the Woods, or the something Kalamazoo Kid or something like that, was a fantastic portrayal of growing up in that era. I recommend reading Bill Bryson's story. So, you know, we could ride our bicycle anywhere in town, go out, come back at 5 o'clock at night. There was no concerns. As I was growing a little bit older into high school, I could get on the bus, take the bus by myself, go downtown Milwaukee and walk around the big city. And I enjoyed that a lot. It was a big deal in mid-50s when a pizza place came into Menominee Falls. There wasn't any Italian food that was pizza before that time. So that was kind of the scene. My father and his brothers built our house, which was right next to the river, basically. And so in wintertime, I could put my ice skates on in the house, walk down to the river, which had been plowed of snow, and skate up and down the river. I was a very good skater. I was very fast and enjoyed that. My families were big. My mother came from a family of 7 kids. My father came from a family of 10 kids. They were strong Catholic families, and almost nobody went to high school. They finished school at 8th grade. And so they had to learn skills of getting through life and doing things on their own. And a lot of them did that. They knew how to do things. They were very handy, the guys especially, on the farm or in the countryside, because you couldn't call on people to come help you like we can here. So there were strong Catholic families. At least 3 of my 23 Rinzel cousins became priests. Some of them wanted to, they went in, they came out. A few nuns went into, this was really quite exceptional in my view. I went to Catholic elementary school, 1st through 8th grade. All the teachers were nuns. And the curriculum was pretty much skill. You learn how to do arithmetic, you learn how to write penmanship and so on. And there wasn't much connection to the outside world, I finally realized now. And I was a fidgety kid. I was a giggler, and I would make wisecracks and stuff. And I got into trouble a lot. Probably the most consistent grading or score that I got on my report card was lack of self-control. That was in the behavior column. And sometimes it was obedience. So we would go to mass every day. I think it was like at 8 o'clock in the morning. I was an altar boy like many of the boys were. And if you were assigned 6:15 mass during the week and 5:30 on Sunday, you did it. that was a farm schedule, right? So people could come and go to mass and then go home and do what they had to do or do it before they went to their jobs. So this was science. What was science? I maybe knew the names of the planets or something like that, but not much to pique one's interest. So when I went to high school, the public high school, there was one public high school, one Catholic high school, one public elementary school, one Catholic elementary school. That was a kind of an eye-opening experience because I was meeting other kids that weren't Catholic and they came from different kinds of households. And the teachers were like telling us about real life experiences. The nuns didn't have so many real life experiences, right? And so that was really something for me. And we could start to think about things. I remember geometry when I was a sophomore. I'd go home and try to do the homework. And I actually had to use my brain to, prompt myself to do the problems. And my English teacher, freshman year, was extraordinary. Everybody thought this English teacher was fantastic. She brought literature to life. I had not had any experience like that before. And it really affected me. I wasn't much of a reader, but I started reading after that and enjoyed it. I liked the high school sporting, events and stuff. I wasn't a jock. I was a small kid. And when we were playing pickup baseball or basketball, I was always chosen last, except on the ice skating. Then I was fast, so that was good. But I enjoyed that high school. But there was a big transition that happened. Oh yeah, so I realize now that I put in my write-up, my aspiration was to be a long-haul truck driver. And I think this really had to do with being so narrow and rigid in my elementary school. I wanted to see what the world was like. And I thought, looking at the people around me, I could be a truck driver, but I want to be an interstate truck driver and get out. And another strange experience that I had was we had friends that had a cabin, a primitive cabin up in the North Woods of Wisconsin. And it was in a place where there was a lot of strawberry fields and cherry orchards and stuff. And one summer we were up there and we joined the migrants that were picking the cherries. And one of the guys I was by 12 or something. He was like 15 or 16. He was a dude. He was a cool guy. And one of the girls in the family who we shared the house with, they got to be a thing. They'd be at the theater together and doing things. And I got to know Pablo. And his world, how narrow I was, seemed cool. Moving around the country, going here, going there. And we exchanged letters afterward from where he lived down in Texas. And that was another factor that was in this get out and see the world. But when I got to high school, that started to fade. And then there was a huge transition. Another story that I should have said was when I was in second grade, my mother and father got divorced. And my father had built this house, right? And he had drinking problems, which was a sad thing because he was a very talented person. And so it was a hard thing in a small town in the 1950s, being Catholic. And I'll never forget that the priest came and told my mother she was excommunicated. She couldn't do the sacrifice anymore. That was a blow to somebody who was coming from a strong Catholic family. We got estranged from the Rinzel family for the most part, except in my school, because there was so many cousins in my class. There was 3 Rinzels, Mary, Larry, and Johnny. And they were up and down the grades because there were so many of them. So that was an important thing in my life because I held that against the Catholic Church. Anyway, she got married again, husband number 2, when I was in 7th grade. He was a retired police officer. He was older than my mother, like about 15 years. And he convinced her that we should move to Florida. because he wanted to fully retire with one of his sister-in-laws and so on. And I had developed asthma when I was about 13 or 14. And that was kind of a wedge that was being used to convince my mother to give up the business she had started in her house of doing people's hair. She was very successful at this. It was really weird. In about 2010, my wife and I went back through Menominee Falls. We stopped at that house, and the person that bought the house wanted it for that business and to live there. And the place looked exactly the same. Those big hair dryers, those big helmets that people had, and the chairs and everything. It was like I was in a Smithsonian room or something. It's amazing. But it was nice she took us through the house. So anyway, he convinced her. So we moved to Florida, sold this very nice house that my father had built, moved into a mobile home park. This was devastating. I left my friends. I'm in a place where I don't know anybody. There was only one other kid in this mobile home park. Everybody else was like 55 or more, right? It was hard. And in school, I couldn't walk to the school. It was 5 miles away. But after a while, I got a car and I made friends. It was not hard to make friends because so many people had moved to Florida from other places in America. So this was opening my eyes a little bit more. I liked that part of it. It was on the west coast of Florida between St. Petersburg and Clearwater, not on the eastern side. And I made friends. And that settled me a little bit, I think. And I became a more diligent student. I really liked physics. The math was easy. Nothing was challenging in the math for me. I got interested with this gang of friends. It wasn't the jock gang. It wasn't the party gang, the popular gang. It was the car gang. Okay, so we got into cars and racing cars on the street, right? This was the time of the movie American Graffiti. I don't know if any of you have seen this movie, American Graffiti, but it was made about the graduation night of a high school class in 1962. The movie was made by George Lucas in 1968, and it really gives you a sense of what it was like. And in these days, you'd take your car and you'd drive up and down the main drag, right? For us, it was Clearwater Beach, back to the mainland, and go to the drive-in frozen custard stand, the A&W, and sit in your car and have Pepsi or a Coke or something like that, and find somebody to race with, go out in some little country road and have a little race, right? And so this was instead of being a jock, I was doing this stuff. And, we modified the car. I mean, I learned a lot about cars. It was one of these things where you want a faster engine, you put your car under a tree, you get a pulley, you take the engine out, you put a new engine in, and I had a hot rod. It was a 55 Chevy, and was really proud of what I was able to learn and do on that with my friends and help. So I was starting to lose this thing about being a long haul driver because I've been exposed to the world, and kids were starting to talk about going to college. Okay, I can do this, Mom. She really had saved money for me to go to college through her business. So it was a big deal for her. I would be the first person on that side of the family to go to college. There was 16 cousins or 15 cousins on that side of the family. So, okay, what are we going to do? Okay, so I was handy with mechanical things, and the space program was going on, and so many people were going into engineering. Okay, so I asked one of my cousins who was actually in Wisconsin, was a technician at AC Spark Plug. And I said, what do engineers do? And he tried to describe to me of, designing a part and telling him how to make the part and so on. And I said, well, okay, I'll try that. So as most people, I went to the state school. That's what we did in those days. You talk to the high school counselor. How do I decide? And he pointed this bookshelf over catalogs from all these colleges. You couldn't Google anything, right? And you just look through these catalogs. But I was only had two choices anyway: Florida or Florida State school. So I got into the University of Florida. One other story about high school. When I was a freshman, we all took this career aptitude test. And, you'd answer these questions and it sort of gave you your profile of what you might be tuned for. And one of the main things that came back was accountant. I thought, oh God, that's horrible. I can't imagine looking at numbers all day long. And so I completely discounted that test. But anyway, went off to the University of Florida and started in engineering. My roommate was a high school kid I knew not well enough, I guess, but living in the dorm was insane. It was like Animal House. I mean, these guys had there was too much testosterone in a living environment, shaving cream fights and running around in the halls and so on. So I got out of the dorm as soon as I could at the second year. And, but, it was, they were scaring you about going to college. They're going to try to flunk you out. You're really going to have to study really, really hard till midnight. Every night is what the impression is you had. And being an engineer, I had to take calculus. Every morning, 7:30, 5 mornings a week, calculus. And that wasn't so bad because I met a guy who I really wanted to make good friends with, Dennis Day. And he was from South Florida, and he was interested in cars. He was very smart, one of the smartest kids I knew at that point in my life. He was an engineer too, but he made a big transition, dropped the full scholarship, and went into psychology. And that hit me. I thought that was pretty extraordinary to give up that money. Anyway, I did pretty well, but by the second year, I was beginning to get bored and starting to question this mechanical engineering. I took classes like mechanical drawing, and I had to take one course that was a practicum in manufacturing processes. It was a shop, and that class was 8 o'clock Saturday morning for 3 hours. Go to the what did you call it? Not the tool shop, the tooling place. And they give you a piece of steel and you're going to make something out of it by using lathes and shapers and things like that. And I wasn't very good. I wasn't good at chemistry lab. I wasn't really good at physics lab. And I hated this. And that made me say, okay, is this what engineers really do? I got to find out what engineers really do before I can make a decision because I'm going to go on with this. So I was starting to whine and complain. And I told my mother, stepfather, oh boy, what now? And I decided that I was going to go on the co-op program that was available to engineering students, which meant you could go to work in an industrial location every other semester. And so I was going to do that. But I had already started talking to another engineering department. And it was a more general engineering, more theoretical engineering called engineering science and mechanics. And I decided, or I thought that when I come back from my first rotation that I might do that. So somehow I managed to get a Union Carbide scholarship the second year I was there. I didn't know I was that good. But it was a $250 scholarship. That paid the tuition for 2 semesters, believe it. It was $115 a semester for the tuition. So they said, okay, you want to do that? You should go to a Union Carbide place. And the biggest place at Union Carbide where I could fit in, they thought, was in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Super. I wouldn't mind trying out Tennessee, another experience. So I said, okay. And so I drove to Oak Ridge with a friend who was also from Florida and went to the job. And instead of being in an engineering slot, because they had used up all the engineering slots, Carbide was pushing on them to find another slot for me. And they found it in the computer center. So, okay, I'll try that. And I didn't have my full security clearance. So I'd actually sit in the lobby reading about computing, Fortran was going to be the language, right? And finally, I got the security clearance to get inside. And actually, the computer center building was not that old. I mean, how long were we doing big mainframe stuff, right? And it was outside the main gates of this big plant I was at. I'll tell you a little bit about Oak Ridge in a few minutes, but this was a turn-on experience for me. Learning how to program a computer and being in the group I was in. It was a group that was doing scientific computing for engineers and physicists and so on, projects. And then in addition to that, they were developing algorithms and making algorithms public available. So this was a numerical analysis group. And the big deal was numerical linear algebra. This you could do. You had algorithms already, and now you had mainframes to do this on. So these guys were passionate about their work. And that really struck me. And they knew some of the hotshots in this business internationally. And one of the leaders of this field was Alston Householder. Maybe if you took numerical linear algebra, you've heard of the Householder transformation. And Householder was at one of the other plants in Oak Ridge. And these guys were getting they had probably master's degrees or maybe just bachelor's degrees. They were going to get their PhD with Alston Householder, part-time. So they were, really working very hard and very passionate about what they wanted to do. So Oak Ridge, Tennessee. How many of you know about Oak Ridge or Los Alamos? These were secret cities developed during the war to develop the atomic bomb. This was the Manhattan Project. Los Alamos in New Mexico and Oak Ridge in Tennessee were secret cities. They bought up land and there was gates and you couldn't go through the gate unless you had an ID. If some relative came to visit you, you'd have to drive to the gate and pick that person up to come in. The government built all the housing. They did this. They came from nothing to 2 years when there was 75,000 people in Oak Ridge. There was 3 major plants. There was X10, which was Oak Ridge National Lab. This was very basic research, nuclear reactors. There was Y12, which was more of a weapons plant. I don't know if they produced a lot of individual weapons. It wasn't high production weapons. It was specific, to the bomb. And then there was the K25, which was the biggest plant where I was. This was the gaseous diffusion plant. This is the plant that purified the uranium to make the fissionable product out of uranium, a small percentage yield. The process was gaseous diffusion. It took an incredible amount of energy and a huge amount of space. At the time, this was the biggest building in the world. It was 44 acres, this building. And it took the same power each day as it did to light New York City. So it was a big project. And it was like, the people going to work, they'd leave the little village, well, the city, and on buses and cars and carpools and get out to K25, which is about 7 or 8 miles out, and the other places around. And every once in a while, there'd be somebody's father, they'd say, your badge is showing a little activity here. You better not go home for a few nights and we'll clear this up. There was radioactivity around and in some of the water supplies. And so on. It's very interesting, this history, right? How do you get people to work in a secret city? Well, you recruit the physicists and engineers and so on, but you have to selectively, but you place ads for people that want to help in the war effort and stay in America. You don't tell them where they're going. People will volunteer to help. And they'll come to Knoxville, which was the nearest city. They didn't know where they were going. They weren't told. They'd get on a bus. They'd take them out to this city that didn't have paved roads at the time for many people. It was muddy. It was dirty. Everything was coal heat. And this is what you're going to live in, right? And they weren't told what they were doing. Most people didn't know what their individual job was. Design a piece to do this. Watch these dials, and if they do this, make it in the record book. And there was billboards around the town. Shh, don't talk about what you're doing. Don't tell anybody about what you might think you might be doing. They didn't, most people didn't know until the bomb was dropped. And that they had contributed to it. Right? So there was a lot of talented intellectual people in the town. It was a very special town. The schools were extraordinary. And when 1954 came and the Civil Rights Education Bill was passed, Oak Ridge schools integrated immediately, 1954. I graduated from high school in 1962 in Florida. And there were Black people. There wasn't any in my high school. I didn't live near any Black people. I never talked to a Black person in a conversational kind of a way. It was slow going those years. So in Oak Ridge, there were still some facilities that were not integrated. And I can remember when I first went there, I lived in one of the dormitory structures that were still left over from the Manhattan Project. It was still a very active place. These plants, Cassius Computer wasn't doing much anymore, although some, because they were still fueling reactor research and so on. I lived in this dormitory thing. I remember going down into the common room and there were leaflets on the table and they said, if you're white and want to fight, come join us. And it was KKK. They were going to counter a demonstration that were trying to desegregate the public laundromats in Oak Ridge. So even in Oak Ridge in 1960, that was still going on. So anyway, you know, I met many people there, people from all over the country, co-ops from very many different places. So that was really fun. You felt like hot stuff. You were co-ops in this place that had a high school and there was some cute girls around and stuff. And we had a good time being co-ops. And I became socially much more mature in Oak Ridge. I didn't study very much because I did my 8-hour day and maybe did some work at home. Sometimes we'd go to the plant, and I never forgot this. My boss, Funder, said, as we were doing an algorithm for the QR method for doing eigenvalue computation, right? He said, we're going to go in at night. So we went in at night, and he said, I know the operators. So we're on the mainframe, and he gave the operators cigars so they'd be happy. And so we were using the mainframe as if it were a PC. We were guiding an iteration process. That was really cool. This was a big computer. Room was filled with equipment, right? The computer terminal. Why was it filled with equipment? They were almost all tape drives because everything had to be input, output. The computer, the mainframe state-of-the-art IBM 7090 had 32K. Memory, active memory, 32K, no joke, okay? And so you had to do a lot of reading and writing stuff. But anyway, you know, how did you get your stuff in? You had punched cards, right? You key punch your cards, give them a card deck. And if you were lucky, the turnaround was a few hours, right? If it was a big project, you'd have a box full of cards maybe, and you might get it back the next morning, okay? You had to debug yourself. If you really screwed up and it wasn't easy to debug, they'd give you a cordon. Okay, so you'd get this computer paper about this stack of computer folded paper sitting on your desk. Everybody knew John had a core dump last night, right? And then you'd be looking at the machine language instructions, trying to figure this out, or you'd go to the systems staff, right? And they'd help you out. So anyway, I got this real appreciation for, you know, there can be really interesting work in an industrial research setting. And so when I went off to graduate school, I went with that in mind. You know, I don't have to become an academic. I could, I don't have to, because there's opportunities out here. So.
And at what point did you decide to even go to grad school?
Well, so this was, I went back to Florida after my first rotation and came into this engineering science department, right? And taking many kinds of interdisciplinary courses, physics, chemistry, high level, atomic physics, physical chemistry, math. And I liked it, I really liked it. And the department was unusual. It was a new growth department. And it had imported faculty from many different regions and different ethnicities, Asian, Greek, and so on. And these people were theorists. They did theory a lot. And I thought, this is cool. I started working with a professor, Professor Armanakis, who had been here at Columbia and at Cooper Union. And when he saw that I was really doing well at Oak Ridge and doing well with this project, and I liked this, said, you got to go to the Krop Institute. And he wasn't real popular with the other faculty, wanted me to stay in Gainesville. But anyway, I took that to heart. And so I finished my bachelor's degree, and I did 3 rotations in Oak Ridge every other semester. And I was now feeling a part of the group, very much a part of the group. And I went to small conferences with them where these numerical linear algebra guys, and my boss Wonderlic would say, you're really going to have a good time. There's going to be a lot of the Germans there are going to sing German songs and drink beer. And that was cool. That was a normal person talking to me, right? And that was fun. And so anyway, so I got accepted. There was very few places where you could go to do real applied mathematics. It was mostly pure mathematicians who may have tolerated somebody was doing differential equations or something like that. And most, I probably don't need this cue card anymore. So what was I saying?
Correct, but I also wanted to ask a question. So you're
Sure.
at this point to where not just the first to go to college, but also to go to
Oh God, yes.
How did your family react?
I was called the brain, right? I don't think anybody went to, nobody else in the family out of all those 38 cousins got a PhD. I mean, maybe you could consider getting priesthood or something like that. Oh yeah. And now I said that. Okay, so there was 3 priests in the Rinzel family. My sponsor, Aunt Lorraine, had these 3 pictures on her wall. And I mean, don't touch these pictures, right? And 2 of the guys were brothers, twins. And one of them married Sister Mary. So his picture came down off the wall. Then another one left the priesthood. So it was only Father Jerry left on the wall after a while. But right, so right, I was the only one to go. So I was far away from my family because they were in Wisconsin. More about that a little bit later, but so after the 3rd cycle, 1965 was the fall of 1965. And part of the reason I socially matured was because I had this great roommate. His name is Mike. And he and I became very, very close. And he was from Middle Tennessee. So I'd get to see Middle Tennessee too and go to Nashville and sample the music and all that stuff. And so this is another part of Tennessee I really liked. And he was from the countryside. So I went to his home and I went to the small country church, and the minister came by the porch on Sunday afternoon and sat and chatted with you and so on. And his father had a little country store there, and gave me a real appreciation for some of the movies you see about rural South, right? So anyway, the last semester, the last cycle in 1965, we were dating, and Mike set me up in a blind date with the girlfriend of one of his date, and that was my to-be wife, Kathy. She was an Oak Ridger. She had been home from college for that semester, or maybe even just for Thanksgiving. Anyway, we started dating, and we did New Year's Eve together at the Armory, a dance. And honest to God, we fell in love after those few dates. It was amazing. We get choked. She made me completely uninhibited and appreciated me for what I was. And likewise. And so then I went back to Florida and we were at a distance. And so we were communicating back and forth, letters like every day. I mean, you wrote letters, right? And I would drive up every once in a while and we meet that way. And one time she came down to Florida. I met her family. I didn't say this, but my family's in Wisconsin. They were proud, they were smart, they were relatively simple, but they weren't intellectual. I never heard anybody discuss a book they had read. Kathy's family was different. Okay, it was a very small family. She only had one cousin, and her stepfather was Uncle Paul. Uncle Paul was a professor at the University of Kentucky. Uncle Paul went in, I think he was drafted at age 17 or 18. They were from Kentucky. He was drafted and he was in the Army Air Corps. And he was a tail gunner on a B-17. And on a bombing trip over Germany, they got shot down. And he got captured and went to Stalag 17 concentration camp. He was there for 2 years. He said, when I was going down that parachute, you know, by the way, you never checked your parachute. Somebody packed your parachute. Okay. You prayed as you were going down. And he said, if I get out of here, I'm going to make something of myself. He was a smart guy. He went back, went to college, got a PhD, got into the chemistry department, and did extremely well. He became famous as a professor and good teacher and became on the board of trustees and so on. So meeting Uncle Paul and Kathy's family was another positive thing in my growing up. Grandpa Reed, Kathy's grandpa, was the mayor of a small town in Kentucky, which is the county seat, south of Lexington, Stanford, Kentucky. He was a barber, simple guy. We'd sit around the kitchen table after dinner and he'd tell these incredible stories that he had, you know, real life stories. He was a barber. When he was a young barber, he cut Colonel Sanders' hair. Colonel Sanders lived nearby and needed haircuts, right? So Colonel Sanders didn't get famous until he was 65, right? So anyway.
He was a real person.
Yeah, he was a real person. He really was. His chicken shack, you know, they would stop and eat chicken when they were going from Oak Ridge to Kentucky. And so it was really great. He got discovered. Somebody came in there and said, oh my God, this is really, yeah, you know, we can do something here. So that's how that happened. So I was thinking about coming into a family that made impressions on me. Side story, you know, if there's not a lot of questions, I can go on with some of these side stories, right? Being in this Oak Ridge, you know, these houses, you had an A house, a B house, a C house, or a D house, right? And they got themselves into a D house, which was a pretty good house. And later, maybe they moved up. I don't remember exactly, but you could see it was time to paint the houses. So you could see coming down the street, the painters, brown, gray, green, white, brown, gray, green, white. And Kathy's mother standing, I don't want a greenhouse. I don't want a greenhouse. Brown, green, you green lady. Stuff like that, stories like that. So anyway, got into Quran, right? I got a phone call from the fellowship person, Paul Garabedian, fluid dynamicist in Quran. He said, you know, we really like you. We'd like for you to come. We're going to give you a computing assistantship. Computing assistantship. My God, they actually read my application. They know I didn't do computing, right? Almost everybody was an RA. There was no TAs as far as I could tell. I had to work really hard to get an experience at teaching while I was a graduate student, right? So this was a big deal. Kathy had hoped that we would stay in Gainesville. It was a nice small town. She could maneuver in that town. Coming to the big city from East Tennessee was a little scary. But that's what we did. So it's not easy finding a place to live. We ended up in Queens, in Richmond Hill, which at that point was still pretty much German and Greek. and our landlord was Greek. We lived on the top of a 3-family home. This was Archie Bunker neighbor. Really? Does anybody know Archie Bunker? Oh my God, don't get me started. You can still see it. And we're rewatching some of it. Anyway, it was a very blue collar, there was no blacks.
What was your rent?
Oh, it was about $115 a month. It really was. Yeah. And funny story. I really, I like to take showers. And so whatever we looked at had to have a shower. Not all places had showers, still bathtub. We had a bathtub that had feet on it, right? And I looked, oh, it's got a shower. So we're working our butts off cleaning this place up, right? And I'm really looking forward to this shower. So I step into the shower, turn it on, but the shower is not connected to anything. Anyway, Dino and his brother fixed that up and worked that out. They were really nice to us. They taught us how to be a little street smart. You're in New York City now. If you gotta, things gotta really smell right before you buy something or let somebody do something, right? So that was really quite a nice experience. My roommate, my office mate, one of my office mates was George Papanicolaou. George Papanicolaou was an incredible student. He was a student of Joe Keller as well. Joe Keller, by the way, was a student of Richard Courant, who set up the Institute in the late 30s. George was headed to be famous. He did become a Courant director for a while before he moved to Stanford. Anyway, I had to study to pass the written qualifiers, which was going to be in the spring of the year 1968, after the first year. So George's wife worked at the Metropolitan Museum. We knew Kathy was going to probably have to have a job because we didn't make enough. And so Kathy, George's wife said, Kathy, why don't you just go up to the Metropolitan? You can probably get a job. Kathy, this was really scary, walk up to this big museum and take a subway up there by herself. And she's got a job. She interviewed and got a job in the publicity department. So every day she'd take the subway from Queens, had to change from a bus to a subway and walk from the Third Avenue line or whatever it was over to the Metropolitan. And got to funny story was, if I don't know if you all read the New York Times, but there is this thing on the city edition called Daily New York City. And there's the diary, New York Diary. So today's diary was about a story about a young woman who lived in Queens and got divorced and said, moved to Brooklyn, Bensonhurst. And she's going to set up her apartment. So she's at the lumberyard gathering stuff. And this guy tries to help her carry stuff. And so when finally it comes around to, so where are you from? And she says, she thinks to herself, is she talking about ethnicity or location? She figures it's location. She says, I'm from Queens. I just moved here to Brooklyn. She says, yeah, I can tell by your accent. He says, in a very heavy Brooklyn accent. So Kathy's at the Metropolitan. One day she gets enough courage to ask her office mate. She says, what country are you from? In her southern drawl, right? What country are you from? And he says, I'm from Brooklyn. And what country are you from? Anyway, by the end of the year, she really liked it, but there was incredible turmoil in 1968. By this time we'd been through the riots of 67 and 68, the civil rights riots in New York, in Philadelphia, everywhere. And Martin Luther King was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. My hot rod car was stolen and stripped on our wedding anniversary, our first wedding anniversary. We drove to Manhattan, had a good time. We drove home, and that morning I couldn't find it the next morning. And there was another thing I was going to tell you, I forgot what that was. But the big thing that happened in that spring was that the Selective Service decided they weren't going to allow graduate students to have deferments anymore. So that was it. I was from a draft board in Florida, Clearwater, Florida, where there was a lot of retired people. And I was pretty sure I was going to get drafted. And pretty soon I was called for a physical. So I went to Brooklyn for the physical, and I had asthma. It was getting better, but I still had asthma, and I had poor eyesight. I had amblyopia in one eye. And I remember we're sitting there writing, filling out our history on these forms, and the guy who was at the front of the room said, Sergeant, whatever he was, he said, and don't think you're going to flunk this physical, okay? You can have flat feet, asthma, bad eyesight. You're going to pass this physical. Sure enough, I passed the physical. And this is real. This is real. What are we going to do? I can't, I'm going to have to do something. Could I go back to Oak Ridge and get some kind of, military industrial deferment? Could I go to some place where other people are doing contract work for the government, Defense Department work, and get into doing all the stuff I knew how to do at the point? And Mike, who had finished his undergraduate in Tennessee, was now working at Bell Labs. And so we're whining to him, and he says, one of my friends told me about that public health service. He said, if you can get yourself into the public health service, you can satisfy your military obligation and never wear a uniform. And so how am I going to do this? So somehow I found out that there was a computer center at NIH. So I wrote the director of the computer center. I know how to do this, this, and this. I could really help you out. And I mean, I didn't say it like that, but he bought that and talked to people, and they said, I think we can take you on. But you got to get your master's degree. So this was in the spring, and we had settled into, this is going to be a nice 4 years, right? But world changed. And so at that point, I knew I had to pass 2 language exams. I had to write a master's thesis. I had to pass the written exams and something else. I passed the physical for the public health service. So I really worked hard. I had more courses to take. So I took summer courses. I did this, that, and the other, and got that master's thesis written. I could do that because I was working on a project for one of the professors in Keller's group, Don Ludwig. And so that said, okay, we can go to the NIH, knowing nothing about biology and caring not about biology, had nothing in front of me. So I came to the job, and we moved to Bethesda, and came to the job, and bingo, my not big supervisor, but my immediate supervisor was a Black man. And my office mate was a Black woman. I thought, this is really cool. This is equal employment. This is EEO. Government is giving jobs to Black people, and they're in my business, right? So I thought that was really very nice. Opened my eyes a lot. But anyway, the super boss said, I see, Rinzel, you've had electrical circuit courses and stuff like that. I hated the lab. He says, you can work on the brain. Well, okay, why not? So I started reading some simple books and stuff, and I was assigned to work with another guy who was farther in his PhD, and I was just a master's student, right? He was from University of Pennsylvania. He was doing neural networks with cellular automata kind of models. But the project was going to be spike separation. And one of the neuroscientists came to tell us about collecting spike data and so on. This was Ed Everts, the guy who invented the primate chair. He was in the Neurology Institute, came over and showed us the spike trains and stuff like that. So, okay, start working on that. But it was learn some principal components analysis, cluster analysis, stuff like that. But it was pretty primitive in those days and pretty ad hoc. And we were making up our own algorithms and stuff. And I got pretty uneasy about it. And I didn't like it after a while. And I was getting a little depressed about it. So I went to talk to my boss, And he was a kind man. And I told him, you know, I really would like to use some of the tools that I learned in my first year of graduate school and my computing skills. And you know anybody that does mathematical physics on anything here? And he said, well, there is this guy in the other institute who studies neurons with mathematical physics. So he was kind enough to have in his mind that I would work almost all the time on that. And he would take care of my position. And so he introduced me to Wilfred Roll. And that was amazing. Will was willing to take me. I knew nothing about neurons. So I was reading these simple books and he was teaching me. He was basically tutoring me. And I was learning from the world's expert. He only worked with one or two people at a time. And he posed the question of, he had developed cable theory by this time. He showed me the picture of a neuron and a reconstruction, the Golgi picture, and you could see the dendrite had these little spines on it. And he said, you know, people have no idea what these spines are doing, why they're there. Why don't we try to work on that problem? Okay, that sounds cool. And so Will Roll, I can tell you a few.
Yeah, it's 3, so we should slowly start wrapping up.
Okay, all right. So anyway, he got his PhD. He was on the Manhattan Project at University of Chicago and got into biophysics there. And that's where Casey Cole was, who was the father of the space and voltage clamp. And Will got an interest in synapses and said, you need to go work with John Eccles in New Zealand. So Will went to New Zealand and did physiology, learning about synapses. And of course, this is motor neurons in cat spinal cord. And started asking questions, well, how does a neuron work? And the synapses are out on the dendrites and so on and so forth. And before he finished his PhD, Eccles moved to Australia. Will stayed there and finished. And Casey Cole, who I knew at the NIH years later, told me, he says, he got this letter back from Eccles. He says, this guy Roll, he is really sharp. And he's doing experiments with us. But when it's time for lunch, he doesn't go to lunch with us. He just sits there and does calculations. So anyway, I got to hear all these wonderful stories from Will, and we worked on this problem, and it was going to be to make a dendritic neuron model. I was going to do the simulation using cables and so on, and putting a spine on that and coupling the spine to the dendrite. And we did that, and it got to be it was a hard computational problem. And I said, you know, this is a really tough computational problem. I probably made a mistake. The code's so complicated. He said, well, let's see if we can do something analytically. So using his incredible physical intuition, came up with a superposition scheme to solve for a single input on a single branch of a branching tree. I can remember us being at lunch talking about this, and you could see his mind going like this, and bingo, he said, I think I got it. And we went back up to the office, sketched it on the board, said, this is going to work. And so, you know, within a year, we had material for at least 1 or 2 papers. And I wrote it. I said, I'm going to present this at a meeting, a SIAM meeting, which is applied math meeting in Denver. And I got to go to that meeting and talk about this project with him. And it was interesting. It was a special SIAM meeting dedicated to the growing field of mathematical biology. 2 of the people in the math research branch where Will was were plenary speakers. And another one was Hirsch Cohen. Hirsch Cohen was the guy who became the instigator of computational neuroscience funding from the Sloan Foundation and from the Schwartz Foundation. He was the right-hand person of Jerry Schwartz, the advisor, scientifically. And I remember he was a plenary speaker, and he had seen my talk at a contributing session. He mentioned my name because he was talking about young people coming into the field. Like, I got a chill through me. But anyway, came back from that, and we finished 2 years at the NIH, had a son. born at Bethesda Naval Hospital. I mean, I was an officer. I was a second lieutenant in the public health service, and came back here, and I was GI Bill. I could have the GI Bill, and that helped a little bit. And but I'll tell you, our son was born, and while Kathy was still in the hospital, I came to look for a place because we had to get back here. I had a really hard time finding a place to live. He said, "Where is your wife?" I said, "She's down there. I am a vet. I have a job as a graduate student. I don't see your wife." It's really hard. And so we finally found a place in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, with Crazy Ethel. That's what we called her, right? The landlady. We lived in the upper part, and she lived in the middle part, and Big Rose lived in the lower part. This is a strictly Italian neighborhood, right? And this was a mafia neighborhood, right? So we learned a lot. The Godfather was being filmed about this time, so we learned a lot about the mafia. It was the safest neighborhood I ever lived in. You didn't have to lock your door, right? Big Rose, Crazy Ethel was crazy. Okay, that's why we called her Crazy Ethel, of course. She was hard to deal with. Big Rose would go out at night, and you could smell the perfume from where we lived. We figured she had a nighttime job, probably in a bar or something like that. And she became our friend. And Big Rose said, "No, she gives you any trouble, let me know. I'll take care of it." So it was that kind of a thing, another learning experience, right? So anyway, Joe Keller, am I coming back to NYU? Right, coming back to NYU. And Joe Keller realized I was interested in neuroscience, and math biology had penetrated into Courant by this time. There was people doing math biology, and he had Bert Cohen, was a personal friend of his, and others. And he gave me this project about looking at the traveling wave behavior of a cable, of a Hodgkin-Huxley cable. We used a simplified model, and there's a question. There is the traveling wave solution to the Hodgkin-Huxley equation that matches the velocity and so on, but there's a second solution, which is smaller amplitude and slower velocity. Huxley conjecture, he knew about this. Huxley conjecture, that's got to be an unstable solution to the cable equation. You won't ever see it physically. So the question was, can you prove the instability of that second solution? So we used a nonlinearity that was piecewise linear, and we could solve for the traveling wave. I could solve for the traveling wave solution. And there was other people doing more general theory on this too. It was timely. People were, if you look at the cable equation, it's a diffusion equation. It looks like a diffusion equation with these auxiliary variables for molecular gates, right? Ionic channels. And people were becoming aware that diffusion with nonlinear reaction can lead to pattern formation, okay? And this was a big deal about Alan Turing. You maybe don't know this, but Alan Turing wrote a foundational paper in pattern formation having to do with developmental biology and morphogenesis. And people were studying reaction diffusion processes back then. The Bilyusov-Zhabotinsky reaction, you put it in a dish, and you'll see waves, colored waves going. Art Winfrey was one of the guys that was pioneering that simple experiment. So when I finished my PhD, I was primed for a job market that was hot for this kind of stuff. So I had different choices. I'm almost to the end. I had different choices of jobs and postdoc. I had already had 3 years of experience working, right? So I didn't need a postdoc. And in math, you didn't need a postdoc. You just go into a tenure track position, right? And I couldn't have gone into a physiology. Who would want a mathematician back in those days? And if I went into a math department, a normal math department, you just do math. There's no theorems, you know? So I had a few choices. And University of Maryland was one. There was a Center for Applied Mathematics there, and they wanted me. They offered me a job. It was close to the NIH. But I said, you know, I really like the NIH, and I like to be close to the biologists, and I want to pursue that. So I took the job at NIH, And after a couple of years, realized that my position in the computer division wasn't going to satisfy me. So Will worked to get me into the group that he was in. He wasn't the head of it, but I got into that group and became a PI. And soon I had postdocs and so on. And it was the ivory tower of ivory towers, right? I mean, every 5 years, you'd write a progress report and say what you wanted to do. And you didn't have to apply for grants, and people were just good. I mean, why did we end up in the Diabetes Institute? They decided early on when they were developing a computer center, well, you know, we got a computer center, we need some mathematicians here. Okay, well, let's get some. And they recruited a guy from across the street, which was the Naval Medical Research Institute, where Will also was. This guy, Heron, he had a math biology degree from Reshevsky, who was the father of mathematical biology at the University of Chicago, where Householder also had been doing the Manhattan Project. Householder went to, I told you, to Oak Ridge, set up a math panel. So this guy, Heron, had gone from Chicago to Householder for a while and realized that when he was coming to NIH, he said, I'll do it, but it's going to be on the model of the math panel at Oak Ridge. We are not going to be a service group for the computer people. We are going to develop theoretical biology as we see fit. And the open-mindedness of this particular institute, diabetes, we'll take them. And that was it. We were put in the administration building, central administration building, on the floor of the director of the institute, because we wouldn't take up any lab space. And we had our own little center of mathematical biology. And I think it's the oldest center in the world now. It's been since 1957. So eventually I became head of that. Right? And then, and Will always said, keep your connections with applied math people and so on. By this time I had networks of biophysicists, neuroscientists, and applied math. And the director of our institute, the scientific director of the intramural program, changed, and he wanted more. He didn't want us to be doing computational neuroscience under his money tree. Okay, so he said, you're fine, you can stay here, you're doing good work, but you can't, fill your open slots. And by this time I had, 5 or 6 postdocs. It was a great thing for me. But I could see it was going to be limited. And I was almost starting to look around. Kathy wanted me to start looking around, even though she had started her career as an elementary school counselor. And about that time, Dave McLaughlin came to Kumon. And he had interdisciplinary slots. And he worked with Tony. He said, I want one in neuroscience. I want to work in this field. And so brought me here, and things worked out extremely well. I couldn't have imagined a better place to be. This is an unusual department, systems neuroscience and values theory and so on and so forth. I didn't tell you one small part of the story. Can I have another couple of minutes? So Joe Keller was an extraordinary applied mathematician. He made his bones on doing geometrical optics. You learn ray theory in undergraduate physics, diffraction that goes over there, and you draw these straight lines and the bouncing angle and so on and so forth. Well, how do you get from Maxwell's equations to electromagnetic waves into rays? So this requires an asymptotic theory. So Joe Keller developed the asymptotic theory that went with that. So then you can use that asymptotic theory to see how rays bend around objects and so on. So he had a major group getting DoD support and sonar and other kinds of waves and so on. And he had broad interests. Also, he became the head of the math department at the Bronx campus. NYU had a campus in the Bronx, University Heights campus. And so he could use that department to bring in young applied mathematicians. And they would do their teaching there, they would come down here and do research, and it was a very active group. Dave McLaughlin was one of those guys in that group, right? In 73, NYU was in financial trouble, and they had to sell that campus. And these young guys, some of them could be absorbed, but some of them had to leave. You know, when they closed on your department, there's no promise of tenure. So this was actually not it was bad for some of them to have to leave, but it scattered applied mathematics to metastasize at different locations in the country, Arizona, Northwestern, NJIT, and a couple of other places. So it really spread applied mathematics around. And Dave was at Arizona. He went to Princeton, and then he came to NYU. Frank Hoppenstadt went to Utah, went to Michigan State, went to Arizona State, and so on. So it was a big community, right? And when another part of that story was that when closing down the engineering school in the Bronx, we pleaded with some of the universities around here, please take some of our faculty. And Brooklyn Poly, which was a very good engineering school, said, okay, we'll take some of your faculty, but you're going to sign a statement now that says you'll never have engineering again. Okay. And things turned around 10, 15 years ago when Brooklyn Poly was going down and NYU was really skyrocketing. And Brooklyn Poly, gee, we'd like to have your name, stuff like that, right? And one thing led to another. So now we have the Tandon School at Brooklyn Poly, and Dave McLaughlin teaches at the Tandon School and so on. It's been an incredible ride, but again, the message is, you know, take your experiences, you know, get as many experiences as you can, and hopefully you'll find a passion, and, you know, you'll get a career out of it. Talk to your colleagues. You know, if you feel like crying or complaining or whatever, find people to talk to. People are really sympathetic and wanting, because they're going through some of the same stuff or have gone through it themselves, right? So that's what I say.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So yeah, like what you were just saying, like, do you feel that after all these explorations, you ended up in a field that where you were meant to be eventually, or was it just more like a happenstance of people you met? And
It was people I met that I could suddenly feel the passion. I could feel it. And it was partly because the people I was dealing with were very kind. And I wouldn't have done it if they weren't kind, actually, because I'm not that assertive myself. I need that kind of kindness to feel back to me. But man, I loved it. And still, you know, love thinking about these things. So it can happen. Some people are so good at so many things, it's a little harder to find that passion, I think, because you can do it, you know, and you can do a lot of different things. But me, this happened. You know, I do think CNS is extraordinary. We have this great rotational system, and the rotations are long enough so that people really get a sense of what the lab atmosphere is and that they can do a project. It's not like, you know, 6 weeks or 2 months. It's long enough to really find out what you like and don't like. It's different in math. It was very different in math in those days. You go, you work with your professor, and that's it. Now there's maybe a little bit more group atmosphere in math, but it was different. Okay, yeah.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Yeah, I'm happy to sit around and talk more if anybody wants to, but I know this has been